I came across the photograph while inventorying the Westbridge University archives, the usual clutter of forgotten donations from private estates. It was tucked inside a manila envelope, brittle with age, labeled in thin typewriter ink, War-era family, unverified provenance. When I slid it free, a faint scent of dust and lavender rose from the paper, the smell of old albums and long-shuttered rooms. The image was surprisingly well preserved, a wedding party, circa 1917 by the style of dress. The men in black morning coats and tall top hats, the women in dropped waist dresses trimmed with lace. The bride, radiant and slightly nervous, held a bouquet of roses that cascaded almost to her knees. Behind her, a row of smiling guests crowded the church steps. Everything about the composition spoke of ordinary happiness. Except one thing. The man standing directly behind the bride, older, solemn, with streaks of grey in his sideburns, was holding something in his gloved hand. At first, I thought it was a flower, or perhaps a prayer book. But when I magnified the scan later, the shape resolved into something else entirely. A small, shriveled hand, no larger than that of a child, clasped delicately in his palm. I leaned closer to the screen, heart ticking faster. It wasn't possible. The light fell wrong. The texture was too organic. I adjusted the contrast, filtering through sepia, then grayscale. The truth became inescapable. It was indeed a hand, a human one. I sat back, chilled by that familiar mixture of curiosity and unease that every historian knows but rarely admits. The feeling that you've stumbled onto something meant to stay buried. The photo came from the Haraway collection, a recent donation from a family estate in Surrey. There was no detailed provenance, only a note from the executor. Recovered from attic trunk, May 2021. Belonged to Great-Aunt L. Haraway, schoolteacher, deceased 1974. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man's expression. Everyone else in the photo looked toward the camera, eyes bright, mouths parted in laughter. He alone stared slightly to the right, as though distracted by something, or someone, standing just outside the frame. The next morning, I began the formal cataloguing. The back of the photo carried a faint studio stamp, M. Withers and Company, Portraits and Ceremonies, Brighton. A quick search revealed that the studio had operated from 1903 to 1920 before a fire destroyed the building. Only a handful of negatives survived, most housed in the National Portrait Registry. I emailed a contact there, an archivist named Louise, and attached a high-resolution scan. Her reply came within hours. Curious. I've seen dozens of Withers wedding plates, but never this one. The exposure looks unusually long. Note the faint motion blur around the bride's bouquet. That's not typical for Withers work. Also, I'd advise checking the far right of the image. I think you'll see what I mean. I zoomed in again, scanning the right edge. Between two of the groomsmen, barely discernible in the shadow of the doorway, was the outline of another figure. The body was faint, almost translucent, as though double exposed. A young woman, by the shape of the face, though her eyes seemed closed, her head tilted forward, hair falling across her cheek. I enlarged further until the pixels began to grain. That's when I noticed it. A faint trail of what looked like water staining down from her mouth. Louise called that evening. "Do you know who these people are?" she asked. "Not yet." The file was mislabeled. "I'll need to trace the Haraway line." "You should," she said, her voice lower, "because that's not a studio shot. Look closely. They're standing on church steps. And the bride, she's wearing black beneath the veil. I hadn't noticed that before. But when I adjusted the color channels, the truth emerged. The dress, though bleached by age, was not pure white. It was cream overlaying dark fabric, almost grey, mourning cloth. That night I returned to the archives. The building was empty except for the faint hum of the refrigeration units. I pulled the envelope again and read the brittle label in the archivist's cursive, Wedding of Lydia Harraway and Captain James Olcott, 1917. A quick search through the university's digitized war records confirmed that a Captain Olcott of the Royal Sussex Regiment had been reported missing in France, November 1916. The wedding, if the date was correct, had taken place months after his disappearance, which meant either the record was wrong or Lydia had married a ghost. It was easy to dismiss such thoughts as fatigue. Still, I printed the photograph in high resolution and pinned it to the board beside my desk. In that sterile fluorescence, it seemed almost alive. The more I looked, the more the image resisted interpretation. The father, if that's who he was, held the small hand delicately, almost reverently, at waist height. The object's texture was wrong for any kind of glove or fabric. It had nails, and one of them, faintly visible under magnification, seemed bitten down to the quick. By the following week, I had convinced myself that I needed context, not conjecture. I requested parish marriage records for 1917 in the Brighton area. There was indeed a ceremony registered under that name, March 12, 1917, St. George's Church. But next to the groom's name, a notation appeared in faded ink. Posthumous license granted. My breath caught. A posthumous license allowed a marriage to proceed despite one party's death, often for inheritance or legitimacy of unborn children. It was rare, but not unheard of during wartime. So Lydia had married her dead fiancé. Still, the presence of the man holding the hand nagged at me. Parish records listed him as Mr. Edmund Harraway, the bride's father. Age 57. Occupation, undertaker. It explained the composure, the formality, the gloves, but not the object. I turned to the local newspaper archive. In the Brighton Gazette of March 14, 1917, a small announcement appeared. Quiet nuptials observed at St. George's for Miss Lydia Harraway, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edmund Harraway, proprietors of Harraway and Son Funeral Works. Ceremony attended by family and close friends, in remembrance of Captain J. Olcott, fallen hero of France. There was no photograph in the article, none ever printed, which meant the one I possessed was private, perhaps taken by the family themselves. I kept digging. 2 days later, in the April edition, a smaller notice caught my eye. Tragedy at West Pier. Young bride succumbs to fever weeks after symbolic wedding. Mrs. Lydia Olcott, née Harraway, laid to rest beside her late fiancé. The bereaved parents request privacy. I stared at the date. April 2nd, 1917, 3 weeks after the ceremony. A chill passed through me. The photograph, by all accounts, should have been taken on the day of the wedding. But one detail contradicted that. The small bouquet of lilies clutched by the bridesmaid behind Lydia. Lilies of the valley, a funeral flower. By the time I left the archive that night, my mind had constructed its own grim hypothesis. Perhaps the father, in grief or denial, had arranged a final photograph with his deceased daughter before burial. Post-mortem portraits weren't uncommon in the early 20th century. But if so, what of the other guests? The smiling groomsmen, the laughter frozen mid-frame. They seemed too alive, too unknowing. The following morning, I took the print to a photography conservator, Dr. Collins, who specialized in pre-war emulsions. He studied it under magnification for several minutes before speaking. "Curious," he murmured. "See here. This portion, the bouquet, was touched up. Someone added pigment after the print dried. And this area." He tapped the space around the father's gloved hand. "This is overexposed, intentionally." As if to obscure something. "Something," I repeated. He leaned closer, or someone. That night, the first of the disturbances began. I was alone in my office, reviewing the digital scans, when I noticed that the image seemed slightly altered. The lighting had shifted subtly, as though the photograph had absorbed the room's ambient glow. The bouquet appeared brighter, the father's expression darker. Then faintly, from the computer's speakers, I heard a soft hiss, the sound of static. It took a moment to realize the audio file had autoplayed from the scanning software. But there was no sound file attached to the image, none at all. I muted the speakers and leaned back, heartbeat echoing in my ears. On the screen, the father's hand was clearer now. The small fingers he held seemed curled inward as though tightening. I shut down the system and left. The following morning, I returned to find the print slightly warped. The paper had buckled in the night, a faint dampness spreading from the lower corner. When I touched it, the residue smelled faintly metallic, like iron, like blood. I told myself it was condensation from the air conditioning. I told myself many things, but later, when I looked again, I could swear that one of the bride's eyes was open. I didn't sleep much after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces from the photograph hovering in the dark, frozen smiles, pale hands, and that gloved man holding something small and terrible. By morning, I convinced myself exhaustion had distorted my judgment. The rational explanation, I told myself, was always the truest. But in archival work, rational can be a fragile word. I decided to visit Brighton. The parish where the wedding had been held still stood, though the church itself had long been deconsecrated. St. George's was now a community arts hall, its stained glass windows boarded from the inside, its graveyard overgrown. I arrived in the afternoon, the February light thin as dust, and found the old caretaker sweeping leaves from the entrance. When I mentioned the Haraway name, his expression changed. "The Undertakers?" he asked. My grandmother used to tell stories about them. He let me inside. The nave smelled of plaster and rain. He pointed toward the chancel, where a worn brass plaque still gleamed faintly. "In memory of Lydia Haraway Olcott, 1895 to 1917. Beloved daughter, wife, and friend. Though the bell is silent, the vow endures." Below that, a second plate had been added much later, erected by the Westbridge Historical Society, 1963. I crouched to read the engraving more closely. The quote bothered me. Though the bell is silent, the vow endures. I'd seen similar inscriptions in memorials for those married after death. Yet something about the phrasing, endures, felt less like comfort, more like a warning. The caretaker told me there had once been a family crypt, sealed in the 1930s after flooding. "Some say they moved the coffins," he said, lowering his voice. "Others say they left them there. You can still feel the ground sink after heavy rain." When I returned to my hotel that night, I went over every note I had gathered: parish records, death announcements, the restored photograph. I compared them side by side. And that's when I noticed a detail I'd missed before. The father's right glove was faintly transparent. I could see the outline of his bones beneath it, as though the hand itself were already decomposing at the moment of exposure. The next morning, I visited the Brighton Historical Society. The archivist, an elderly woman named Clara, was delighted by my interest. When I mentioned the Haraway family, she frowned. "Oh, dear. You found that photograph, haven't you? You know of it?" "Everyone who's worked here long enough does. We had a copy once, years ago, but it was destroyed in the flood. There were complaints." "What kind of complaints?" She hesitated. "People said it changed when they looked at it. That the expressions weren't the same from day to day. I thought it nonsense, of course, until I saw it myself." She led me to a file drawer labeled H. Miscellaneous inside were yellowed clippings and a single letter, dated 1938. To whom it may concern, we request that the photograph of our family, taken at St. George's in 1917, not be displayed publicly. Certain likenesses appear altered. My father insists it was never meant for others to see. The light within it has not gone out, and we fear it never will. M. Haraway. The phrase, "the light within it," echoed in my head. Photographs, after all, were nothing but trapped light. Back at the hotel, I scanned the image once more under infrared. This time, faint markings appeared along the edge of the print, nearly invisible to the naked eye. They weren't scratches, but deliberate etchings, shallow and careful. I enlarged them. The words were in an archaic hand. Returned, but not alone. I sat there staring at that line until the screensaver dimmed the room. Returned from where? And who, or what, had come back with them? Over the following days, my research deepened into obsession. I discovered that the Haraways had indeed owned a funeral parlor on Chapel Street, just 2 blocks from the church. It was demolished in the 1950s, but one photograph remained, a 2-story building with a carriage drive and a painted sign reading Haraway and Son, Rest with Dignity. There was one more record, an incident from June 1917. A police report describing a complaint of disturbance of the peace at the Haraway residence. Neighbors had reported hearing a woman's voice calling from beneath the ground. The report ended without resolution. By this point, I'd begun to dream about the photo. In one dream, the wedding guests moved slightly, like figures on an old reel. The bride's bouquet wilted as I watched. The father raised the small hand higher, turning it toward me, and I saw that the fingers were stitched to his palm. I woke in the dark, the echo of soil shifting in my ears. On the final day of my stay, I went to the Brighton Municipal Cemetery, where Lydia and her parents were said to be buried. Their plot was near the back, under a crooked yew tree. 3 stones stood in a row. Edmund Haraway died. 1920, his wife Anne died. 1918, and Lydia died. 1917. The grass between them was sunken, as though the ground had been disturbed long after burial. I knelt to read Lydia's epitaph. The words were nearly eroded, beloved of 2 worlds. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. The photograph sat in its archival sleeve on the desk beside my bed. I had resolved to hand it over to the university's special collections once I returned. But sometime after midnight, a noise woke me. The faint sound of paper shifting. I turned on the lamp. The photo lay face up, though I was sure I'd placed it face down. And something in the image had changed. The father's head was slightly turned. His gaze, once directed to the right, now met mine, and the gloved hand, once holding that tiny relic at waist level, was raised chest high, as though presenting it. I stared, transfixed. The object he held was no longer a hand. It was a small bouquet of hair, human hair, bound with ribbon. I grabbed the photograph and shoved it into the drawer, heart hammering. But the faint smell of iron rose from the paper, stronger than ever. By morning, I was ill. My reflection in the mirror looked drawn, my skin ashen. I told myself I'd been working too long with chemicals and unventilated archives. But when I returned to my office at Westbridge, the lights flickered on their own, and the photograph, which I'd sealed in a drawer, lay neatly centered on my desk. This time, a faint shadow appeared at the bride's side, a man's outline, blurred but unmistakable. Captain Alcott. His face was ruined, half obscured by the texture of soil, and yet his arm extended forward, resting gently on Lydia's shoulder. I called Louise. "I need you to come see this," I said. When she arrived, I spread out the print under sterile light. She leaned in, studying the image carefully. "It's impossible," she whispered. "I catalogued this photo 20 years ago in a private collection. The version I saw didn't have This. What did it have? Only the wedding party. No shadow, no distortion. But there was a note in the margin. Retouching complete, per request of E. Haraway. She hesitated. There's a rumor, you know, that Edmund used to prepare post-mortem portraits, sometimes combining exposures. Her words clicked into place like a key in a lock. Multiple exposures, one living, one dead. In the early days of photography, that was how spirit photographs were made, overlaying negatives to suggest a ghostly presence beside the living. But this wasn't illusion. The light density, the depth, they were consistent. The figures were captured at the same moment. That evening, I compared the photo with known Withers studio plates. Every parameter matched except one, exposure duration. This plate's shutter had remained open 4 seconds longer, long enough for something else to enter the frame. I decided to end it. I placed the photograph into an acid-free envelope, sealed it, and prepared to deposit it into cold storage. But as I walked down the hall, the envelope grew warm in my hand. By the time I reached the archive vault, a faint dampness seeped through. I placed it on the steel table, hesitated, then unsealed it. The photograph inside was blank, utterly blank. The image had vanished, leaving only the faint outline of a hand pressed into the emulsion. For weeks afterward, strange things happened in the archive. Files went missing, returned hours later to the wrong shelves. The humidity sensors malfunctioned. And one morning, I arrived to find my office door ajar. Inside, the photograph had reappeared on my desk, the image fully restored. Except now, one more figure had joined the group. A man at the far left, standing slightly apart, his features indistinct, but his stance unmistakably mine. I submitted my resignation 2 days later. Months have passed since then, yet I still see them sometimes, in reflections, in the corners of rooms, in the flash of headlights on wet pavement. Lydia's face, pale and serene, framed by a veil that never moves. The father behind her, holding something small and new. I've learned not to keep photographs anymore. Not in my house, not on my phone. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the air feels heavier than it should, I catch the faint click of a shutter in the dark, and I know they're still posing somewhere, waiting for their picture to be taken again.